Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone here. I'm Dr. Jan Kearney, Professor of Medicine, Associate Dean for Public Health, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rachel Johnson. She is the Robert L. Bickford Jr. Green and Gold Professor of Nutrition in the Department of Nutrition and Food Science, College of Agriculture and Life Science at the University of Vermont. She is also Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Vermont College of Medicine. She received her Bachelor of Science degree at the Pennsylvania State University, Master of Public Health at the University of Hawaii, did a dietetic internship and is a registered dietitian at the Indiana University Medical Center, and has a Doctor of Philosophy from the Pennsylvania State University. In addition to her academic studies, Dr. Johnson has held many leadership positions at UVM, including Associate Dean for Research at the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, Dean of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and Director of the Vermont Agricultural Experiment Station, and Associate Provost in the University of Vermont. She has served as a Senior Nutrition Advisor for Eating Well magazine. She is a member of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and is active in state and national activities. She is active locally and nationally in the American Heart Association. She serves on the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee and as chair from 2012 to 2014. In 2012, she was elected as a fellow of the American Heart Association, and this distinction recognizes scientific and professional accomplishments and volunteer leadership and service to the American Heart Association. She has also had numerous federal appointments. She served on the U.S. Department of Agriculture and U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Committee, the National Academy of Sciences of the Institute of Medicine panel on the dietary reference intake for the macronutrients, the U.S. FDA Additives and Ingredients Subcommittee on the Food Advisory Committee, the President's Council on Fitness, Sports, and Nutrition Science Board, and most recently in 2013, she was invited by First Lady Michelle Obama and the Let's Move initiative to the White House, who is convening a group on food marketing to children. She has held numerous editorial board appointments, including the journal Circulation, which is the official publication of the American Heart Association, and is a journal reviewer for more than 20 peer-reviewed journals. She has served on national scientific review panels at the United States Department of Agriculture and the National Institutes of Health. She was a recipient of many awards, such as the Fellow of the American Heart Association and a University Scholar at the University of Vermont. She has authored more than 100 peer-reviewed publications, numerous book chapters, invited publications, presentations, and commentaries, and is to date the recipient of 40 research grants. She is also a prominent local and national spokesperson on nutrition and health. She is the author of numerous blogs for Yahoo, Shine, Huffington Post, the American Heart Association, and has been a frequent commentator for Vermont Public Radio. She is currently an American Heart Association National Media Spokesperson and an American Heart Association Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Voices for Healthy Kids National Spokesperson. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Johnson, who will speak this evening on No Sugar Added, How to Reduce Health Risks and Keep Life Sweet. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jan. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Wow, she really read my CV. That was impressive. It's so great to see so many familiar faces, friends and colleagues and students, and it's just wonderful to be here this evening. Thank you so much for coming. So I hope you're ready for a wild ride. I'm going to talk to you about sugar. I'm going to talk for about an hour, and then I want to leave plenty of time for questions, because I'm sure you'll have many. But also thanks to the College of Medicine for inviting me to participate in this great community medical school event. Now let me see if I can, oh great. Okay, so we're going to start out with the global sugar glut. Over the past 50 years, consumption of sugar has tripled worldwide. And in many parts of the world, the sugar supply averages 500 calories or more per day per person. Now, note that I talked about sugar supply, because that's different from sugar consumption. This is just showing you the sugar supply in these various countries around the world. And in a minute, I'm going to talk to you about sugar consumption. Well, in 2009, the American Heart Association, which, as you heard from Dr. Carney, I was chair of the AHA Nutrition Committee and am currently a spokesperson for the American Heart Association. We published a paper on a scientific statement on dietary sugars intake and cardiovascular health. And I had a wonderful writing group. It took us almost 2 years to write this paper. It has about 120 references, so it's a very comprehensive paper about sugars and cardiovascular health. Why did we decide it was time to weigh in on added sugars? Well, we felt that there was no reputable organization that was making a solid, concrete recommendation about how much sugar is there room for in a healthy diet. The DGAC is the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. So the Dietary Guidelines form the foundation of federal nutrition policy. So all federal programs like school lunch, school breakfast, the WIC program, they all have to adhere to the Dietary Guidelines. So in the year 2000, I actually had the privilege of serving on the Dietary Guidelines Committee. I won't go into the politics of that. Notice the word advisory. That means that we advise the secretaries of USDA, DHHS, and the U.S. Surgeon General. And then once we're done advising, they decide what the dietary guidelines are going to be. So we advise that you should choose beverages and foods to limit your intake of sugars. But the food industry was not too keen on that wording. They weren't really thrilled about the word limit. So they took our advice but changed it to that we should moderate our intake of sugars. Then in 2005, the dietary guidelines come out every 5 years. In 2005, they said choose and prepare foods and beverages with little added sugars. So we went from moderate to little. Then in 2010, there was still no quantifiable recommendation. They said to reduce the intake of calories from solid fats and added sugars. But we decided that consumers needed a number. What does moderate mean? What does little mean? What does reduce mean? They weren't willing to say what an actual number was. And so when we came out with our statement, it was the summer of 2009, and this was a headline in the Wall Street Journal. It said, sweet surrender, sugar curbs urged. And it said that the AHA took aim at the nation's sweet tooth, urging consumers to cut back on the amount of sugar they get. And what we said, we clearly said, in a healthy diet, most American women should consume 6 teaspoons or 100 calories a day from added sugars. You should not consume more than 6 teaspoons or 100 calories a day. And for most American men, it's 9 teaspoons or 150 calories a day. We were the first organization to come out with a specific recommendation for added sugars. And this received tremendous media attention. It was New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, CBS, all over. Most scientific statements that the American Heart Association writes get about 20 to 30 million media hits. So a media hit is you bring a newspaper into your household, and there's 4 people in your household that read that paper. That's 4 media hits. So it's not necessarily how many newspapers are sold, it's how many people actually see that particular paper. So this American Heart Association statement had 68 million media hits. It was the most media hits any statement had ever gotten, and I think has gotten since. But how much added sugar is America actually eating? Remember, keep that 6 teaspoons, 100 calories a day for women, 9 teaspoons, 150 calories a day for men in your mind. So the average American diet contains 320 calories or 20 teaspoons a day. Men are eating about 335 calories or 21 teaspoons, and women about 15 teaspoons. This doesn't include teenage boys. They're off the chart. They consume the highest amounts of added sugars in the population. Now, if I can get this to work, I'm going to show you some videos. And hopefully I won't need Mark, my technology guy. Here we go.
You get Destiny for PS4? Got it at Walmart. Did you also pick up some better gamings?
remember that slide about Mexico, because I'm going to talk to you about Mexico in a minute. Okay. There we go. So I teach our Fundamentals of Nutrition course, our large intro course, and I have about 250 students this semester. My students regularly send me videos. So one of my fantastic students sent me that video about sugar, but they're just great. Okay, where are we getting our added sugars from? Well, Americans are consuming about half of all of their added sugars in sugar-sweetened beverages. So if you combine soda, energy, and sports drinks with fruit drinks, it comes to about 46%, or almost half of all our added sugars. So remember this, because I'm going to be talking a lot about sugar-sweetened beverages. Then we get the rest in grain-based desserts, which is a term nutritionists like to use. It's just cakes, cookies, pies, a sweetened grain. Dairy desserts, that would be what? Ice cream, right? Candy, and then ready-to-eat cereals, so pre-sweetened cereals. But most of it, remember, we're getting from beverages. Okay, why are we seeing this? We've seen this real change in beverage consumption patterns. Most of the audience here probably remembers growing up and having milk on the table. And you had milk 3 times a day, and milk was the beverage of choice. You had milk, or you had water. You didn't have anything else. Maybe once in a while on Saturday night, growing up, I would get an 8-ounce glass of ginger ale with some popcorn that my mother made. But that was it. We never had a 1-liter bottle of Coke on the dinner table. But over the last 30 years, consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, so when I say sugar-sweetened beverages or SSBs, I'm talking about soda, fruit drinks, sport drinks, energy drinks, has almost tripled, while milk consumption has declined. And since this slide was made, since 2006, the decades-long decline in U.S. milk consumption has accelerated, and milk consumption peaked around World War II, and it's fallen almost 30% since 1975. And in fact, last year was the largest decline, the biggest ever year-long slide since 1975, with a decline of 3.3% in milk consumption. So that's concerning. And this is one of the reasons why. I hope you like this.
Pinewood. Recently, many of the local restaurants have changed their small size option to a whopping 64 ounces.
That's correct. And it's great for the consumer. More bang for the buck. Are we putting bargains on trial here?
How could any sane person call that small?
Well, if the customer truly wants a smaller size, there is an option.
Oh, do you mean the little swallow? Does anybody buy that?
Some girls buy them for their dollhouses, but they're not very popular. I mean, for only a nickel more, you get 64 ounces.
Well, Paunchburger just recently came out with a new 128-ounce option. Most people call it a gallon, but they call it the regular. Then there is a horrifying 512-ounce version that they call child size.
How is this a child-size soda? Well, it's roughly the size of a 2-year-old child if the child were liquefied. It's a real bargain at $1.59.
I'm sorry, Miss Pinewood, but why would anybody need this much soda?
It's not my place to speak for the consumer, but everyone should buy it.
You like that one? Okay. So why are we so concerned about the high intakes of added sugars? When I talk about added sugars, these are the sugars that are added in processing or preparation of foods. I'm not talking about the naturally occurring sugars fructose in fruit and lactose in dairy products. So that's why I keep using the term added sugars to distinguish it from those naturally occurring sugars. But I'm going to talk to you about what we know about weight gain and obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and then diet quality. So the gold standard in nutrition research is randomized controlled clinical trials. This is the gold standard. And when we have this kind of evidence, we really feel like we have a very robust or strong science base to look at a question. So this was a study. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And it's a huge deal because it is one of those randomized controlled clinical trials. Oops, sorry. So what they did, it was done in Boston. They took 224 overweight and obese adolescents, and they randomly assigned them to an intervention or experimental group and a control group. The experimental group received a 1-year intervention. They had home deliveries. They actually home delivered bottled water and diet drinks for a year, and they were encouraged to avoid sugary drinks. The other group, the control group, just got usual care. So what happened? Well, if you can see here, after the intervention lasted for a year. So after 1 year, the control group that just got usual care gained 3.5 pounds. Now, no, these are adolescents. They're growing, so they should be putting on some weight. And then you've got the the control group gained 7.7 pounds. The intervention group gained 3.5 pounds. So you had a 4.2 pound difference. That was a statistically significant difference. So we could confidently say that the intervention group gained less weight than the control group over this 1-year period. Then they stopped the intervention, and they looked at the weight gain over the following year, and the intervention group started to pick up more weight. There was still a significant difference after 1 year, but the difference was greater when they were actually doing the intervention. So this was some good evidence that sugar-sweetened beverages do contribute to weight gain in adolescents. This was a second, again, randomized controlled clinical trial that was done in Dutch children, 641 normal weight children, and in this case, they randomly received at school either 8 ounces per day of a sugar-sweetened beverage or 8 ounces of a sugar-free beverage. And they actually did this at school. Somebody told me they don't think here that you could necessarily get this through an IRB or Human Subjects Committee because they're actually giving the children the sugar-sweetened beverage when we know all the problems related to it. But I'll show you in a minute what the authors argued. They argued that the children were actually getting less than American children consume. So what they found is over 18 months, the children in the sugar-free group gained an average of 13.9 pounds, where those drinking the sugar-sweetened beverages gained 16.2 pounds. So it was a significant difference that the children getting the sugar-free beverage actually gained less weight. And if you look at this quote, I really like this. This is what the author said. We found that masked replacement of a sugar-containing beverage. They said the beverages tasted the same. I'm not sure I buy that. But children in the U.S. consume an average of almost 3 times as many calories from sugar-sweetened beverages as the amount provided in our trial. So they speculated that decreased consumption of the beverages might reduce the high prevalence of overweight in these children. So pretty convincing evidence that sugar-sweetened beverages are related to weight. This was what we call a meta-analysis or a systematic review of the literature, and they concluded that all lines of evidence support the conclusion that the consumption of SSBs has contributed to the obesity epidemic, and at least 1/5 of the weight gained between 1977 and 2007 in the U.S. population can be related to this increase in sugar-sweetened beverage consumption. A really compelling statistic. So keep this in your mind, because when I talk about policy changes, these are some of the things that the soft drink companies are sort of saying, oh, we don't have the evidence that it's related to obesity. That's why I wanted to show you those controlled, randomized clinical trials, again, which are the gold standard. Okay, what about diabetes? This was a study. They had 50,000 women. It's the Nurses' Health Trial, which many of you may have heard of. It's conducted out of Harvard. They've been following this cohort of nurses for several decades. They measure what they eat, and then they're following their progression over time to see what diseases they develop. And these women were followed for 8 years, and after adjustment for potential confounders, so things like smoke, what was their physical activity level, family history of diabetes, those kinds of things that are related to diabetes, as you can see out here, in those consuming, so your baseline group are those who are consuming less than a sugar-sweetened beverage less than 1 time a month. And if you look out all the way here to those women that were consuming one once a day or more, they had at 83% higher risk of developing diabetes than the baseline, than the women who were only consuming sugar-sweetened beverages less than a month. So pretty interesting evidence. Again, this is epidemiological work, so you can't necessarily prove cause and effect, but you're seeing this strong association between sugar-sweetened beverage consumption and the development of type 2 diabetes. Okay, sugar-sweetened beverages and heart disease. I want to talk to you about blood pressure. So this is the Framingham Heart Study, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. It's a long-term, ongoing cardiovascular study of the residents of the town of Framingham, Massachusetts. It began in 1948 with 5,209 adult subjects from Framingham. It's now in its third generation of participants. And in the Framingham study, they found that consumption of one or more soft drinks a day significantly increased the odds of developing high blood pressure. Then this is another study on sugar-sweetened beverages and hypertension called the INTERMAP study. And this was a very, very rigorous study. Look at the measurements that they took in these people. They had, almost 2,700 people, 4 24-hour diet recalls. That's one way we use to assess dietary intake. We ask people, what did you consume in the last 24 hours? They did 8 blood pressure readings each time they were measured because of the variation in blood pressure readings, and 2 24-hour urine collections. They mainly did the urine collection because it's a very, very accurate way to measure people's sodium intake. And because this was really a study about blood pressure, diet and blood pressure, they wanted to, it's called a biomarker. They can use the 24-hour urine collections to measure how much sodium you've taken in. But in this study, they also found that sugar-sweetened beverage intake of greater than 1 serving or more per day was associated with high blood pressure. So some good evidence that sugar-sweetened beverage intake is associated with high blood pressure. To continue on the heart disease part, this is, again, a study. It's the NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It's a survey that the federal government conducts regularly where they look at what people eat. They take a lot of biometric kinds of measurements, and then they look at these associations. What they found in this particular study was that Americans were consuming a mean of 15.8% of their calories from added sugars, and they found significant correlations between added sugars and blood lipid levels. So as many of you know, my students know this in the room, do you want your HDL high or low? High, right, high. High is good. So you want your HDLs high because that's the good cholesterol. That's the cholesterol that scavenges cholesterol from your body and helps you remove it. And so look here where you can see that as the percent of energy from added sugar increased, HDL went down. That's not a good thing. The more added sugars people were consuming, the lower their HDL levels were. Then here you've got triglyceride levels. You're seeing an opposite effect. We don't want high triglyceride levels. And so here, as the percent of energy from added sugars went up, people's triglyceride levels went up. So again, causing these abnormal or low levels of HDL, high level of triglycerides, and increasing risk of heart disease. This is a really cool study. This study just came out this year. It was in JAMA. And what's so cool about this study is they looked at death from cardiovascular disease. So one of the criticisms we get sometimes, oh yeah, you looked at blood pressure, you looked at lipid levels, you looked at all this stuff, but did people really get heart disease? What happened to mortality from heart disease? So this paper actually looked at added sugar intake and cardiovascular disease mortality. And I want to read some of these points because I want to make sure that I get them right. But they found that most adults, 71%, consume 10% or more of their calories from added sugars, and about 10% of the people in the sample consume 25% or more of their daily calories from added sugars. So 25% or more of total calories coming from sugars. That was 10% of the sample. People who consumed more than 21% of daily calories from added sugar had double the risk of death from heart disease than those who consumed less than 10%. And people who consumed 7 or more servings a week of sugar-sweetened beverages were at 29% higher risk of death from heart disease than those who consumed 1 or less. And as you can see from this chart, the findings were consistent across age groups, across different sexes, racial groups. The non-Hispanic blacks were a little low here. So here's baseline. This is 1, and this is your adjusted, what they call the hazard ratio. So the increased chance that you would die from coronary heart disease based on your intake of sugars. So this was all over the news. I don't know how many of you saw it, but I was very, very busy on the phone as a spokesperson for AHA when that paper came out. But here's your conclusions and relevance, that most of us adults are consuming more added sugars than are recommended for a healthy diet, and they observed this significant relationship between added sugars consumption and an increased risk of actual mortality from cardiovascular disease. Not just the elevated lipids, not just high blood pressure, but actual mortality. Okay, so what is the mechanism? This whole thing with, okay, so what makes sugar-sweetened beverages unique? When I talk about sugar-sweetened beverages, people say, well, why aren't you picking on like Fritos, or why aren't you picking on Snickers bars, or why are you really calling out sugar-sweetened beverages? And what we've learned is that we don't seem to compensate as well for the liquid calories by eating fewer calories from solid food. So they've done studies where they take people, and it'll be like 2 or 3 hours before a meal, and they'll give them a sugar-sweetened beverage, and they'll give them the same number of calories in solid food. And then they'll feed them that, like, in a laboratory setting, and then 2 or 3 hours later, they'll give them dinner. They can eat whatever they want, and the people who have food 2 to 3 hours before eat less at the next meal than the people who have the same number of calories in a liquid form. So sugar in a liquid form seems to be less filling. And then this was a great slide that I found I really like, because it helps explain the potential mechanism of sugar-sweetened beverages. It's liquid calories. They have a high glycemic load. So a glycemic load is how quickly a food or beverage raises your blood sugar level. So they have a high glycemic load. They raise your blood sugar quickly. And they have a good amount of fructose in it. I'm going to talk to you about that in a minute. Remember, they're mostly sweetened with high fructose corn syrup, and I'm going to show you something about that in a minute. But what this leads to, weight gain, insulin resistance, beta cell, the pancreas, the cells in the pancreas that produce insulin, dysfunction, increasing your risk of type 2 diabetes, inflammation, high blood pressure, which I just showed you with sugar-sweetened beverages, visceral adiposity. That's why we take waist circumference now as a marker for risk in terms of metabolic syndrome, because it's that visceral fat, that abdominal fat, that increases your risk. And then atherogenic dyslipidemia, that's the abnormal blood lipids, leading to metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease risk. So I really like the way that shows it. Then lastly, just this pure and simple idea of diet quality when it comes to a diet that's too high in added sugars. So I show my students this slide. Okay, think of this as a nutritious breakfast. You've got some fruit, some hopefully whole grain bread, some bananas, and a whole grain cereal, an egg, good source of protein. Look at what you're getting: calcium, iron, vitamin A, vitamin C. Here, you've got the donut and the coffee, energy, and almost nothing else. So we talk about nutrient density. So this diet on the left has a very high nutrient density, lots of nutrients for the amount of calories that you're getting, very low nutrient density, very few nutrients for the same number of calories. And so what we know is that high intakes of added sugars are also associated with lower intakes of calcium, fiber, other micronutrients, which are the vitamins and minerals, and other protective compounds, like those healthy phytonutrients that are in fruits and vegetables. And the thing is that most of us don't have the room in our diet for lots of added sugars. If you're if you're riding in the Tour de France and you're expending 8,000 to 10,000 calories a day, yeah, you've got some room for those extra calories and added sugars. Most of us are so sedentary that we can't meet all of our essential nutrient needs and have much room left over for these empty calories. So if you want to have room for them, you've got to exercise more. You've got to move more and expend more calories. I talked about the dietary guidelines earlier, and I wanted to revisit it because I wanted you to see this key message. When they came out and they talked about, so in the 2010 dietary guidelines, they said drink water instead of sugary drinks. That sounds like pretty benign, right? For USDA, for the US government to come out and say that, Lynn Wild, one of my colleagues in the department, is nodding her head, that's like huge. That is so huge. We don't think it's huge, but when you remember the food guide pyramid? Now it's my plate, but the food guide pyramid. So years ago, they came out with a kids' food guide pyramid, and they wanted to put a generic can of soda at the tip of the food guide pyramid. Just like I showed you that the graphic when I talked about the study that was done on the Dutch children, and it was just plain cans. It was just like that. It didn't even, you couldn't even tell if it was Coke or Pepsi. It was just a generic can. And the soda industry went crazy over putting a soda can at the tip of the pyramid that you should have less of that. And it took USDA 8 months to get that new food guide pyramid for kids cleared because of that soda can at the tip of the pyramid. So if you ever serve on a federal committee looking at dietary advice, you always want to be on the group that tells people to eat more of something. So if you're doing fruits and vegetables and whole grains and low-fat dairy, great. If you're doing sodium or trans fats or sugars, watch out, because you're going to get, when I was on the Dietary Guidelines Committee, I got stacks of postcards from the sugar beet growers because their children were going to be starving because if we cut back on sugar, they wouldn't be able to grow sugar beets, they wouldn't be purchased, it was just going to be horrible. So you get really, really lots of pressure when you talk about eating less of something. Okay, I did want to talk to you about high fructose corn syrup because a lot of people misunderstand what high fructose corn syrup actually is. High fructose corn syrup is not just fructose. High fructose corn syrup obviously comes from corn, and and high fructose corn syrup is a mixture of fructose and glucose. Very, very similar to sucrose. What's sucrose? Sugar, like table sugar. So table sugar is sucrose. Then you've got corn syrup and you've got honey, which is also very similar. So a lot of people don't realize that high fructose corn syrup is very similar biochemically in composition to table sugar. Why did they name it high fructose corn syrup? Because there was some evidence that we metabolize fructose a little more slowly than glucose. So there's some evidence that fructose doesn't raise your blood sugar quite as quickly as glucose. So when they first started making it, they wanted to name it high fructose corn syrup because they thought that people would like that. Now, I don't know if you know, but a year or so ago, the industry petitioned FDA to change the name to corn sugar because they thought, oh, corn sugar sounds like a little healthier than high fructose corn syrup. And FDA denied their petition. But they did try to actually change the name of it because it's gotten such bad press. What I tell my students about high fructose corn syrup is it's a marker for a processed food. So sugar, high fructose corn syrup, honey, maple syrup, like I love maple syrup, but it is a sugar. You know, they're basically the same biochemically, but high fructose corn syrup is a marker. If you see it on an ingredient list, then, you know, it's a processed food that's had sugar added to it. Okay, as promised, I want to talk to you about non-nutritive sweeteners. They've really been in the news lately. So non-nutritive sweeteners, a lot of people call them artificial sweeteners. We call them non-nutritive. So you've got several. These are the ones that are on the market and approved. And the first one, monk fruit, that actually comes from a fruit. It's 150 to 300 times sweeter than sucrose, than regular table sugar. Stevia is also extracted from the leaves of the stevia plant. It has kind of a sweet, clean taste. It's 250 times the sweetness of sugar. Then you've got sucralose. You can see 600 times. You've got aspartame, which is commonly used. ACE K. I'm sorry, I skipped that. ACE K. Aspartame. Neotame, that is very rarely used in the human food supply. And then saccharin. I don't know if you saw this, but just this week, Coke and Pepsi announced they're launching product lines of lower calorie drinks with a mixture of stevia and sucrose. They're finding that there's a little bit of an aftertaste from the stevia, where if they mix it with sucrose, it seems to have a more acceptable taste. So Pepsi's coming out with this Pepsi True, and Coke's coming out with Coca-Cola Life. And I think it was Pepsi True. They're saying they're only going to sell on Amazon. So if you want it, you got to go to Amazon to buy it. But the soft drink industry they get it. They know they've got a problem, and they're really trying to come out with products that are lower in calories in order to, the soft drink consumption is going down. But it's being replaced by fruit drinks and energy drinks and sport drinks and some of these lower calorie options. Okay, who uses non-nutritive sweetened? So this is non-nutritive or artificially sweetened beverages. And you can see mainly who's using them. You've got teenage girls, and then adult men and women are the ones that are mainly using these beverages that have the non-nutritive sweeteners. And we're largely using them in beverages, as opposed to very little in actual foods, and some in packets. Almost none in children in packets and foods, a little bit in beverages, and then in adults, much more so in the beverages, foods, and packets. This is just one study done by Jim Hill, who's at the University of Colorado in Denver. And they did this study. He's a big one on this small change approach. He talks about just cut 100 calories a day out of your diet, and it'll help you at least not gain weight. What we try to say, if you can just stop the weight gain, you're good. But they found in this study that sucralose was acceptable to parents and children, paired with 2,000 steps a day, which isn't that much. You're supposed to aim for 10,000. This small change approach to lifestyle modification was effective in helping to reduce excessive weight gain in children who were overweight or at risk for overweight. Some people say they really mined the data in this study because it was the overweight children that they saw the effect of substituting 100 calories a day by replacing sugar with sucralose. The American Heart Association, we did a scientific statement on non-nutritive sweeteners because we came out with our paper on sugars, and then the logical question everybody asked was, well, what about artificial sweeteners? If you're telling us we can only have 6 teaspoons or 9 teaspoons, 6 for women, 9 for men, teaspoons a day of added sugars, what are we supposed to do if we want something sweet? So what do you think about non-nutritive sweeteners? So we really looked at the literature, and there's not that much. And what we came up with is that substituting non-nutritive sweeteners for sugars added to foods and beverages may help people reach and maintain a healthy weight. And this next is like kind of a duh, because we said as long as the substitution doesn't lead to eating additional calories later as compensation. So if you put the Splenda in your coffee and then have your chocolate cake because you rationalize that I didn't have sugar in my coffee, you're not going to end up ahead. So it's kind of like just, it's logical. You use them if it helps you reduce overall and maintain a healthy body weight, but just don't use them as an excuse then to compensate. Now, this is the study that is really causing a lot of interest and rethinking about this whole idea of non-nutritive sweeteners. This just came out September 17th. It was published online in Nature, which is a very, very credible, highly respected journal. It's kind of complicated, but I want to give you the high points. So mainly this paper used a mouse model. They studied mice, and what they found was that after exposure to artificial sweeteners, the mouse gut bacteria change. So our gut bacteria, it is the hot thing now in nutrition science. It's all about what food is doing to our gut bacteria, and it's just a fascinating area of research. But the scientists added Splenda, that's the pink packages of Sweet and Low, sucralose, the yellow packages of Splenda, or aspartame, the blue packets of Equal, to the drinking water of 10-week-old mice. Other mice drank plain water or water supplemented with glucose or ordinary table sugar. After a week, there was little change in the mice that drank the plain water or the sugar water, but the group getting the artificial sweeteners developed marked glucose intolerance. So marked intolerance to glucose, which is the precursor to developing type 2 diabetes. So glucose intolerance is a bad thing. When the researchers treated, then this is what's really cool. What they found was that the glucose intolerance seemed to be related to this change in gut bacteria in the mice. So the researchers treated the mice with antibiotics, killing the bacteria in the digestive system, and the glucose intolerance went away, which was really fascinating. Then, this is even cooler, they transferred the gut bacteria from the mice that were consuming the artificial sweeteners to the germ-free or sterile mice, resulting in complete transmission of the glucose intolerance to the recipient mice. So they took mice with clean guts, they transferred the gut bacteria from the mice who had the artificial sweeteners, and those mice developed glucose intolerance. So it's like, whoa. So there was evidence that it changed the gut bacteria. It was this change that was responsible for their harmful effects. Okay, all that said, it was a mouse model. We can't necessarily translate what we find in mice to humans. So they did a very, very small human arm of the study, 7 people. Not exactly a huge cohort of people on which to base public health recommendations around artificial sweeteners. They followed 7 people. They asked a group of volunteers who did not generally eat or drink artificially sweetened foods or beverages to consume them for a week, 1 week, 7 people, 1 week, and then they underwent tests of their glucose levels and gut bacteria compositions. The findings showed that 4 of the 7 volunteers began to develop glucose intolerance. So remember, when you hear all this like, oh my God, you know, artificial sweeteners are horrible, this was 7 people, 1 week, 4 people developed the changes. So obviously, as the authors themselves said, this got huge press. It was all over the press. And as the authors themselves said, we are the first to admit that the human arm in the study has only preliminary results on a small subset of individuals. So as we always say, more research is needed. But certainly interesting. And then this is the Center for Science and Public Interest. They published the newsletter Nutrition Action. These are the movie theater popcorn people and the Chinese food people that have come out and said, you know, they come out and say, oh my God, movie theater popcorn's terrible. It's full of trans fats and calories and everything. And they're a consumer advocacy group. And they said, and I really like this, it'd be a mistake to conclude that diet sodas are worse than sugary drinks, and no diet soda drinker should interpret the new study as license to switch to regular soda. The risk of type 2 diabetes and weight gain far outweigh the new concerns about artificial sweeteners. So we have a lot to learn. We see this really fascinating work in an animal model, and I know that more work will come. But in the meantime, if you're a huge user of artificial sweeteners, you might want to moderate your intake, but I certainly wouldn't, as they say, take it as a license to say, oh, well, I'll just have the sugar. Okay, policy solutions to reduce intakes of sugary drinks. So I hope I've convinced you that we're eating too much added sugars, primarily in the form of sugar-sweetened beverages, sugary drinks, and we need to do something about it. So I'm going to tell you a few of the things that are going on across the country to try to, as it says here, I love this saying, make the healthy choice the easy choice. We have new guidelines in schools for school nutrition. 2 years ago, we changed the school meal regulations such that every child now has to take a fruit or vegetable with their lunch. And for the first time, we actually have calorie maximums in school meals. You may be hearing about that. This year, it's the Healthy, Hungry, Free Kids Act of 2010. They now have regulations for what we call competitive foods. These are the foods that are sold alongside the regular school meal. So that's why we call them competitive foods. So we now have competitive food regulations in place because the school nutrition folks are saying, you're telling me I have to serve a healthy lunch. Kids have to take a fruit or vegetable. They have to have whole grains. They have to do all this stuff. And meanwhile, you're selling French fries and sugar-sweetened drinks in another line that kids can get. So now there's calorie, fat, sugar, and sodium limits on almost every food and beverage sold during the day. The advertising of sugary drinks and junk food on school grounds is phased out. So for example, you could have a scoreboard at a high school football field, but you can't advertise Coke anymore. You can advertise Diet Coke and you can advertise Dasani water, but you can't advertise the sugar-sweetened beverage. So they're trying to create a healthy environment in schools where we're not promoting junk food to kids. Every state had the ability to make their own decision about how they wanted to handle fundraisers. In Vermont, the State Department of Education decided that foods sold at fundraisers, bake sales, need to meet nutrition guidelines. You've probably seen, if any of you read Vermont Digger, he had a thing about no brownies at bake sales. But they've said we want to create a healthy school environment. So you need to find other ways to make money from kids besides selling them cake. But there are no restrictions from foods brought from home. So people were kind of freaking out about that. They said, you can bring whatever you want to from home, but you can't sell it at school. Okay, healthy workplaces. In Boston, they phased out the sale, advertising, and promotion of sugary beverages on city-owned property. This is becoming of more and more interest by public employers. For example, there are now federal buildings in Washington where you can only purchase healthy foods. These are some ad campaigns that occurred in New York City. They talk about, are you pouring on the pounds? You're drinking 40 packets of sugar and just 3 sugary drinks. This is in Boston, don't get smacked by fat. So you're seeing a lot more public health campaigns and ad campaigns along with changes in the food environment to create healthy workplaces. You saw the video before, but the reason I'm showing you this, I'm going to show you a video. Does anybody know what happened in New York City around sugar-sweetened beverages, what Mayor Bloomberg tried to do? What did he try to do? She's not here. He tried to forbid the sale of any sugar-sweetened beverage over 16 ounces. And what he did was he had the health department made a regulation, which then it went through the soft drink companies sued. The American Beverage Association is the lobbying arm of the soft drink companies, and they sued. It went to a lower court. They overturned it. It went to the appellate court. It was very, very interesting. I actually did some work for the law firm that wrote the appeal for the health department, and I reviewed the science in the brief that they did. But they lost at that level as well. So it really got killed, this idea of restricting to 16 ounces. They didn't say you couldn't buy 2 or 3 of them. They just said you couldn't buy one that was more than 16 ounces. 48 teaspoons of sugar. So I want to show you this video about the New York City.
Wow. Wow, Mayor Bloomberg. Wow. I love this idea you have of banning sodas larger than 16 ounces. It combines the draconian government overreach people love with the probable lack of results they expect. What are you doing? We already let you make up a 3rd term as mayor. Put cameras on every intersection, and for some reason, picnic tables in the middle of 7th Avenue? What the is that? This is all we have left. This is all we have.
Well, yeah. Okay. So that gets us to sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, a huge advocacy issue. We have there's a table out there with my colleagues from the Vermont American Heart Association affiliate. We are actually advocating for a sugar-sweetened beverage tax in Vermont. This is a piece that came out of the American Journal of Preventive Medicine saying that a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages would reduce obesity in adolescents more than any other policy, such as exercise, advertising ban, and generate significant revenue for additional obesity prevention activities. We are seeing a lot of similarities between the tobacco tax and some of the arguments that the tobacco industry made around taxation, but we have seen, Jan Carney can tell us, we have seen a significant decline in tobacco use as taxes have gone up. In San Francisco and Berkeley, they have a ballot measure during this next election about sugar-sweetened beverage tax. The industry is pouring. I just read a piece today that they're just between now and election day, they're going to pour $8 million just into San Francisco. I didn't see what they're going to do in Berkeley because the feeling is if they can't get this passed in a place like Berkeley, which is considered one of the most sort of liberal strongholds in the country, that they'll have a hard time getting it through anywhere. But we're carefully watching what's happening in San Francisco and Berkeley. This is kind of long, and I want to make sure I have time for questions, but this was just a video. We did a panel a couple years ago about sugar-sweetened beverages in Vermont, and this just talks about some research that my colleague, Dr. Jane Kolodinsky, did, who's a consumer economist, when they say, well, people are going to cross the border to New Hampshire to buy sugar-sweetened beverages if they're taxed in Vermont. And we said, people are not going to drive to New Hampshire to save 10 cents on a sugar-sweetened beverage, and that's kind of what her research has shown. There is a sugar-sweetened beverage tax in Mexico. Remember those slides about sugar around the world? Mexico passed the U.S. as having the world's highest obesity rate. So Mexico now has the world's highest obesity rate. There's an increasing awareness in Mexico that they have an accelerating public health crisis that could hurt its economy, and only prevention is going to make a difference. Their diabetes rate is going through the roof. They're saying 1/3 of all children born in Mexico will develop type 2 diabetes if this develops. So Mexico enacted a soda tax in an effort to combat their high obesity rate. They charge 1 Mexican peso, which is about 8 cents per liter. And these were preliminary findings of the impact of the tax. They have seen a 10% decline in the purchases of taxed beverages, which would be those sugar-sweetened beverages, and then a 7% increase in purchases of untaxed beverages, diet soda, sparkling and still plain water, juices. So they're seeing this 10% drop in the sugar-sweetened beverages, but then when the merchants complain they're going to lose money, you're going to lose jobs, all these horrible things are going to happen, they're actually seeing an increase in the purchases of these other healthier beverages. So that's kind of, because one thing we don't have any good data yet on what would happen to consumption. We have economic modeling data on what would happen with taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages, but we now have this real-life experiment going on in Mexico that we can follow. Okay, I've got one more trailer. How many have seen the movie Fed Up? Has anybody seen it? Oh, some of my students have seen it. Great, yeah. So this is the trailer.
The epidemic here is worse than previously estimated, much worse.
The message that's been pushed on us, it's your fault you're fat.
Shouldn't be so hard to get them to run around and play, right?
They have voracious appetites and they don't exercise enough.
It's about how active our kids are.
Forget about it.
There are 600,000 food items in America. 80% of them have added sugar.
Your brain lights up with sugar just like it does with cocaine or heroin. You're going to become an addict.
You end up with one of the great public health epidemics of our time.
This is the first generation of American children expected to lead shorter lives than their parents.
I am 12 years old and my doctors have said that I am a statistic.
We're blaming willpower, and it's a crime.
Over 95% of all Americans will be overweight or obese in 2 decades.
We're toast as a country. The sugar industry is extraordinarily powerful. They're in business to make money, not to keep America healthy.
What if our whole approach to this epidemic has been dead wrong?
The government is subsidizing the obesity epidemic.
To place private profit ahead of public health. Systematic political failure.
By 2050, 1 out of every 3 Americans will have diabetes.
Those diseases are being driven by sugar.
This is the fundamental problem nobody's talking about in society.
We could cure 80% of the problem where they prepared the food in the school.
Tomato paste is a vegetable? Really?
Junk food companies are acting very much like tobacco companies did 30 years ago.
I would reject entirely any argument that they are in any way harmful.
Lying through their teeth.
Kids are being told the biggest lie they will ever hear in their lives.
Ronald McDonald never sells to children. He informs and inspires through magic and fun.
If a foreign nation were doing that to our children, we would defend our families.
Years from now, we're going to say, I can't believe we let them get away with that.
We have to change the diet of America.
It's all preventable.
Okay, so Fed Up is now available on Netflix. It was in the theater briefly, but if you want to see it. So that's all I have. And I'm happy to take questions. I think we have time for questions. Thank you. Yes.
I have a question about stevia.
Yes.
Is it apt to happen that you become addicted to it and it increases
Yeah.
as sugar does?
So the question is, will we become addicted to stevia? Will it increase our health risks? Well, you know, stevia is a natural, we call them high-intensity sweeteners. So it's from a plant. It's a natural high-intensity sweetener. So this whole question of, like, addiction. Yeah, you could talk about aspartame. You know, this whole idea of, are we addicted to a sweet taste? I think one of the criticisms of a lot of use of non-nutritive sweeteners is you do develop a preference for a very sweet taste. So, for example, in children, I'd rather see, like, the children's yogurts with much less sugar in them than they're currently sweetened with. So you don't develop this taste or this craving for the really, really sweet taste. I'm reluctant to, like, use the actual word, you know, addiction, because I think I'm not an addiction expert, and addiction to sugar is going to be you know, my colleague Rob Lustig, who was on there, he's in Fed Up a lot, and he says sugar's addictive. He says that you should card any child under the age of 18 to buy a soft drink. So he's a little bit extreme for me. But I do think that maybe using less of it is if we can develop the taste for a less sweet taste. Yeah.
I'd like to ask about Splenda.
Yeah.
It's not a non-nutritive sweetener, and they say that it is also not, you're not ingesting sugar when you use Splenda instead. So
Right.
Where does that fit into this?
Well, Splenda is also considered one of those high-intensity non-nutritive sweeteners. It is chemically made. They do something chemically to it to make it, again, one of those high-intensity sweeteners. There have been, you know, all kinds of studies. The FDA says it's safe. They've made the product. You can use it in baking. Some people feel that there is an aftertaste to it, and that's... you know, it's just a matter of preference.
Does it affect your gut in the same way that the other ones do?
Well, I mean, if you look at that mouse study, what did they use? They used equal Splenda. I thought they did use Splenda. Yeah. Hang on. Yeah, because I've got the packages down there of what they used. So they did use the Splenda's in the yellow, the saccharin, and then the equal is aspartame. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
When you're doing a diet, they tell you not to drink even diet drinks because the sweet taste triggers something in your brain, the craving for sweet. So people drink diet drinks, but then they want other sweet things because their craving is the same, even though it's not sugar.
Right.
Could you comment on that?
Yeah, there is animal work that has shown that in mice when they consume the drink sweetened with non-nutritive sweeteners, that they develop this craving and they want more. As I said on our American Heart Association paper, there's just very little human data about this. I showed you the one study where they used sucralose to substitute for 100 calories, but we have very little human data to actually say whether that's true or not. Yeah.
So your recommendation was teaspoons, but in the grids on labels, they're usually grams.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that transfer? And then I have a question about yogurt.
Okay, so there's 4 calories per gram in sugar, and then there's 4 grams in a teaspoon. So 1 teaspoon of sugar has 16 calories. So that's how we do it, and we use teaspoons. Primarily, we made our recommendation in teaspoons because that's the way the My Plate does it, the way USDA, they talk about teaspoons of added sugars. So to convert, if you're looking at grams on a food label, just multiply it by 4, and that tells you how many calories it is. And then there's 16 calories in a teaspoon.
I don't drink soda, but I eat yogurt, and I get confused reading the labels on non-fat yogurt. Is the sugar added sugar? Is it the lactose?
Yeah.
How do I go about making informed? Generally, I try to go for as little sugar as possible, but there's 15 grams in one and 7
That's
in
a
another.
fantastic question. And I wish I could tape you and take you to the FDA because they have proposed for the first time in 20 years a change in the food label. And one of the changes they want to make is they want to put added sugars on the food label. But the industry is really pushing back and saying there's no difference in how our bodies metabolize naturally occurring sugars and added sugars. But guess what? Consumers want to know. So you just proved my point. So the only thing you can do, you can take a plain, unsweetened yogurt and look at how many grams of sugar in it. That's going to be from the naturally occurring lactose. So there's probably about, like you said, there's about 12 to 15 grams. Then you take the sweetened yogurt, hopefully of the same brand, and you compare them and you do the subtraction, and that's how much sugar has been added. But I always say if there's no milk or dairy product and no fruit in a product, the sugar that's on the label is going to be added. But it can be really confusing if you have fruit added, but you have some sugar, and oh yeah, it's really hard, which is why we want it on there. Let me take one from this side. You've had your hand up, yeah.
I'm wondering about, this is actually the lead into the last question. I'm wondering about naturally occurring sugars, and I know that, you showed the slide that showed that honey is almost the same as sucrose and isofruit corn syrup in terms of, the biochemical composition. And I know fruit juice, I've heard that it affects it roughly the same way, so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on naturally occurring sugar and sort of how we should think about that in diet.
That's a really good question. So in terms of fruit juice, the American Academy of Pediatrics has made recommendations for children to say you should limit fruit juice for children. No more than 6 ounces a day for up to age 8, and then like 8 ounces a day up to age 12. But to me, apple juice is like not really any better than a soda. It's just fructose. The thing about fruit is you've got the fiber in the fruit that delays the absorption of the fructose, so you don't get the same effect. If you're eating whole fruit, you don't get the same effect that you're going to get with a fruit juice necessarily. In terms of honey, maple syrup, molasses, they're all sweeteners. They're perfectly fine sweeteners. You just want to use them in moderation and recognize that in terms of calories and nutrients, they're really not adding many nutrients to your diet. But yeah, the naturally occurring, like lactose in milk and dairy products, it's what comes with those sugars. So in milk and dairy products, you've got the calcium, the potassium, the vitamin D, the magnesium, all these great nutrients that are shortfall nutrients in the American diet. In fruit, you've got the fiber, the phytonutrients. So that's why we don't want to discourage intake of those naturally occurring sugars.
Would you equate eating honey and maple syrup, would you put that sort of in the same category, though, as adding sucrose to your food?
Yeah, I would. But if you like the taste and you do it in moderation, then yeah. Yeah.
How about the naturally occurring sugars combined?
Wow, you ask a good question. Some of my students are here. What raises your HDL levels?
Alcohol moderation.
Alcohol moderation. Are you? Yes, hi. So what's the definition of moderation?
For a woman, it's 1 glass of wine or 1 serving of alcohol a night or a day, and then it's 2 servings of alcohol a day for men.
Right.
What's the ounces?
Oh, well, Hillary, you probably know. So that's a good way of saying that we know actually alcohol in moderation has beneficial health effects. One of them is it raises HDL levels, the good cholesterol. Moderate alcohol intake is related to lower risk of heart disease. We're very careful in terms of public health recommendations. We're not telling people to go out and drink. So if you can't control your alcohol intake, there's lots of reasons not to drink. Obviously, pregnant women, women that are trying to get pregnant, if you can't control your alcohol intake. But yeah, wine in moderation is fine. No big gulp. Yeah, no big gulp of wine. Yeah.
I'm glad you're on this slide because I was confused by the illustration there. One of them shows the mouse getting artificial sweeteners, which we talked about. The other one seems to be getting sugar and starches, and I'm wondering if that represents the health control.
Well, I think it does. I'll just say I cut and pasted that from the New York Times story about this paper. So the disclaimer on the figure, but I said that the control mice got either water or sugar water. So yeah, having the bread and the potato there isn't exactly a great picture. Good point. Yeah, but I think yeah.
I know that the focus is on sugar, but I missed the fact that carbohydrates are in general a problem with regard to raising blood sugar, and that toast on the recommended breakfast was going to have the same glycemic index or even worse than sugar. There was an interesting study in the annual, the September issue of the Annual Internal Medicine that was a study that demonstrated that a low carbohydrate diet actually was more effective for weight loss and cardiovascular health than a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. Can you comment on?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. I've talked about that study with my class at length. So that is a really interesting study. So what they found was they put people on a low-fat or a low-carbohydrate diet. And the people on the low-carbohydrate diet actually lost a little bit more weight, and their cardiovascular risk factors improved. So what we're starting to learn is that the low-fat, we don't really talk about low-fat diets anymore because it's really hard to adhere to them. A lot of people restrict their fat, and then instead of replace it, we talk about having good fat in your diet because what people would do is restrict their fat and then eat a lot of sugar. So we talk about the Snackwell's phenomena, which is, the Snackwell cookies that were really high in sugar but low in fat. And then we ended up with this mess that we've got with all the sugar intake. But I'm not really answering your question. So my theory on that, and what I tell my students is, whatever people can adhere to, some people can really adhere to a low-carbohydrate diet. They love their meat. They love, they really, it's much easier for them to adhere to. I would have a hard time on a low carbohydrate diet because I love fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and it would be difficult for me. But some people, it's good. My theory on why their cardiovascular disease risk factors improved is because they lost weight. So if you lose weight, your blood glucose is going to improve, your blood lipids are going to improve, your blood pressure is going to improve. Sorry, I'm getting and it's what you can adhere to. There have been other studies, but one of the big caveats about that study, then what's going to happen to those people in 2 years? Who's going to sustain the weight loss? How long can people adhere to that low carbohydrate diet? And that's kind of the big question.
Well, the key to staying on a low carbohydrate diet is not being fat phobic.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, you can't be fat phobic and do a low carbohydrate diet, and I think that's the thing we have to wrestle with.
So we have this big discussion now in the nutrition world. Some of you probably saw the Time cover a few months ago that said butter's back. So we've got this big discussion about saturated fat. I still think that saturated fat is atherogenic, causes atherosclerosis. It's what you substitute the saturated fat for. So if you're cutting out saturated fat and adding a lot of sugar that's doing all of these things, then you're no better off. But what you want to do is cut back your saturated fat, eliminate trans fats, and then add back the healthy fats. So add back the monounsaturated, the polyunsaturated, the olive oil, the avocados, the nuts, plenty of fish for the healthy, heart-healthy omega-3 fatty acids. That's my spiel on the saturated fat carbohydrates. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox. Yes, way up here.
I'm being a little more conscious about sugar and looking at calorie counts and all that stuff on the labels. And I'm seeing this thing called sugar alcohols.
Yeah.
How do you relate that to the sugars? Is it the same thing? Or?
The sugar alcohols, you don't see them so much anymore. They're like, where's Lynn? Mannitol and sorbitol. Yeah, they're sugar alcohols. They came into the food supply decades ago. Mainly, we used to think that people with diabetes could not have any sugar. And these sugar alcohols are less well absorbed or more slowly metabolized. So we thought they were okay for people with diabetes. The whole dietary treatment of diabetes has really changed, where we don't say you can't have any sugar. It's all about moderating your carbohydrate intake over time. So the sugar alcohols, they're safe. They've been around. I don't know a lot about it. My thinking is that they're a little more slowly metabolized, and that's why they became popular.
Do you count the quantity the same as you would a gram of sugar?
I
mean, I've seen diet things that got 1 gram of sugar and 8 grams of sugar alcohol. So what's the deal?
I think so. You know what? Would you email me that question at rachel.johnson@uvm.edu, and I will find out, because I want to know the answer to it. Yeah.
You said that in Vermont, food sold at fundraisers need to meet nutrition guidelines. Is that just in schools? And where could I learn more about this?
Yes, it's just in schools. It just was enacted this school year, so it's fairly recent. My longtime friend Hillary, who works in high school, are you seeing a change, Hillary?
The one thing that has changed is we have an advisor every Wednesday, and teachers last year would bring in outside food, and now that is no longer allowed. So we have a catering service through our cafeteria, which is actually pretty decent, but they have to adhere to those nutritional guidelines. So you order the food within the school. You can't bring it in. So teachers can't bring it in.
Yes, it's just in schools, and you can Google the Healthy, Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010. It's part of, Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign. She's been very active in trying to, childhood obesity has really been her sort of signature project. But we're also working on healthy workplace environments with the American Heart Association. We wrote a paper on the procurement of healthy foods. In the workplace, my colleague Tina Zook, who was here, has been working. She's with the Vermont American Heart Association affiliate, and we've been trying to work with state government to get them to have food procurement standards around having healthy foods. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm going to go till 7:30, but if you need to leave, I certainly won't be offended. Yes?
In Mexico, there are a lot of ads for soft drinks, and in southern Texas, they sell in the stores 5-gallon cans of lard.
Lard. Yeah.
One store brand who finally had to move out because they didn't carry the Mexican foods that the Mexicans really liked.
Yeah.
And they went out of business.
Yeah. It's crazy. They fry the tortillas in the lard, right? Is that what they do? Yeah. Yes.
Because I have a hard time following grams and all these other things, but if you can look at the percent.
Could I take you along with her to the FDA? Because yes, we need a daily value for added sugars, which we don't have. A lot because of the policy implications. And every time we try to do something, the industry goes a little crazy. But yeah, I completely agree. We need a daily value. We have it for fats, we have it for sodium. We need it. Yes. My thoughts on coconut oil are that it is a saturated fat. There's two plant oils, palm oil and coconut oil, that are primarily saturated fat. So my feeling is they do raise LDL levels. They are atherogenic. That's different from coconut water, which is very hot, a very hot thing right now and has a lot of minerals and things in it. But yeah, I'm not a fan of coconut fat. Butter, I would, yes. Yeah.
And then they did a little human study with just 7 people,
Yeah.
and it said they were given, I think it said high amounts of non-nutritive sweeteners. Do you have any idea what a high amount is? I don't have any sense of.
I do. They said that it did not. I read in the paper, it did not exceed the allowable amount by FDA, is what I remember in the paper. Yeah, which sounds like a lot, right? Yeah.
Regular person's daily diet based on what's known now.
Yeah.
How
does it translate?
The limit of artificial sweeteners. So you have a diet Coke, and you may have artificially sweetened yogurt. I have no sense of how much is considered okay now.
I don't think we really know that the safety levels that we have from the studies, where they approved them. I think, it's quite high. So I wouldn't be drinking, 12 Diet Cokes a day probably based on this. But if you have, like you said, 1 Diet Coke and artificially sweetened yogurt, I don't think we have the evidence at this point to say that you need to change that. And especially if you don't have glucose intolerance, if your blood sugar's fine and you've been doing it for a while, then you're probably okay.
What if you do have glucose intolerance?
Yeah, that's a.
What if you do?
Well, if you do have glucose intolerance, and you're using a lot of non-nutritive sweeteners, I would probably try cutting them out, but not substituting, other calorie-containing foods for them, cutting them out and trying to go with either unsweetened yogurts or drink water or whatever and see if it helps with the glucose intolerance. I think maybe the animal evidence is compelling enough that you might want to try it. Okay, yes, I'll take one more.
Maybe off the topic, but there's been a lot of talk recently about having coconut oil.
Yes.
What do you think?
Yeah, I just answered the question about coconut oil, where I said it's a saturated fat, similar to butter, so I'm not a fan. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. You've been a great audience.